All right, welcome once again to our second Danforth Dialogue. The first one was very stimulating. I've heard incredible things since. We're very grateful to Krista and to Ibu and to Natasha for such a wonderful first dialogue. And now please join me again in welcoming to the stage E.J. Dionne, David Brooks, and Krista Tippett.
I liked how unruly it was before we started again. I think we sparked conversation. That's good.
Turn off my phone. That's a good idea. Always the professional.
So welcome back. David Brooks and E.J. Dionne are renowned as journalists, authors, thought leaders, commentators for the New York Times and the Washington Post, respectively. And also, they're known together as conversational and occasional sparring partners on public media. But we rarely get to hear the two of them converse at length and in depth. This is going to be more than the 7 minutes you get on NPR on Fridays, guys. The three of us were actually together the last time at Georgetown at the Berkeley Center in 2009. Was it right after the inauguration? I think it was maybe February. I meant to look that up. So this was the aftermath of 2 terms of a president who had held conservative evangelical Christianity as a primary aspect of his political identity. It was the beginning of the first term of a president, Barack Obama, who had declared that his favorite philosopher was the public theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. What a difference 7 years makes. But I think as I was looking back at that transcript and reflecting on this conversation, I think that the notion of public theology actually, what public theology might mean for the very different moment we inhabit now, is a good edifying lens to frame our next hour of discussion in terms, again, not of what happened yesterday or today or in the last 20 minutes, but to focus on the larger and longer dynamics of religion and politics that we will be reckoning with as citizens and as a polis, whoever wins on November 8th. As we touched on in the last conversation, there is an undeniable human drama, a spiritual crisis beneath the electoral dynamics of this most surprising political season in living memory. And as the three of us discussed all those years ago, the religious enterprise at its deepest is about what binds us together. And theology is as much a sophisticated conversation across time and generations, a sophisticated analysis of the human condition as much as it is a conversation about God. And each of you, in your own way, and I would say increasingly in these years since 2009, has become one of our most searching American thinkers who very often routinely brings theology, and by that I mean religious questions, religious wisdom, voices of religious wisdom, if not necessarily religious teachings, into your reflection on political realities. And you've each, in your writings, described this as a kind of evolution. And so I wondered if we could start by each of you just saying something about that evolution and what it has emerged to as you've responded to political life, or American political culture. So EJ, you were raised by a conservative father to be a conservative. And my understanding is that you really returned to taking Catholic tradition seriously as you discovered the social teachings of Catholic tradition.
Well, could I just say before I begin what an honor it is to be in this sacred space, I want to say that I met Krista 32 years ago, and I knew then that I had met a special person. And nothing, almost nothing, makes an opinionated person like me happier than to be able to say, I sure was right about that. Second thing I want to say is that I want to salute Marie Griffith for building this great center, and it's so great to be here. And the last thing is, I hear that a lot of Republicans are interested in a new nominee. And there are a couple of people in this room I think of as appropriate. We could, in a very old-fashioned tradition, nominate Senator Danforth by acclamation. Which I think would make a lot of people happy. And if he's happy in retirement, then David, it's time for you to stop being a nattering nabob of negativism in your column and step up to your civic responsibility. Your party needs you, Dave.
Except for my appearance on Access Hollywood would be a problem. But,
see, I saw that tape and wasn't going to say anything, but see, I always say that I became a liberal because I'm Catholic, which these days confounds people, but as Ibu's story... Oh, I also want to say what an extraordinary event that was. Ibu and Natasha brought you up. David and I are going to bring you right down. I always say I became a liberal because I'm Catholic, and in my book, Why the Right Went Wrong, I talk about my dad and I, and we had a running dialogue. My dad died when I was 16, and we spent our time arguing and loving to argue. It gave me a whole attitude toward argument that, he gave me a subscription to the New Republic when I was 13 to strengthen my side of the argument. I asked him, and he thought it would be good for me. And so I was really blessed to have a dad who thought this was a good thing, who thought it was good that his kid argued with him, and he ended up training me for what I did for a living. Two things happened to me to begin to change my politics. One is I actually was 12 or 13 and started looking at what the Great Society was doing. And I said, these guys are actually trying to solve a series of problems that the society has. Why aren't we solving them? Why aren't we conservatives doing that? So I became the most boring thing a teenager can be. I became a liberal Republican. And then, over time I decided that didn't work anymore, but I was fast. I thought there was an obligation. LBJ had identified a series of problems that really did need to be solved. And so that was the first step. And the second step was, we're joined as well by Benedictines, because I went to a Benedictine high school, and in a religion class, we could pick any book we wanted to read for that class and write a report on it. And I chose Martin Luther King's Strength to Love, that great collection of his sermons. And that book began a real transformation in me. I saw things I hadn't seen before, and so that was the beginning of my journey. And then when I was in college, I too was influenced by Dorothy Day, the Berrigan brothers, and a whole tradition that was actually much more radical than I was. I actually wrote an entire conscientious objector statement from a Catholic point of view. I checked the box when I registered for the draft, wrote this statement, and like all vain writers, I was sitting, it was after my dad died, we were living with my uncle, I was sitting in this basement my cousin and I used to go to, rereading this, and of course I said to myself, this is really good. And there's only one problem, I don't believe it. And I discovered that I actually believed in just war, and I actually wrote my draft board back, withdrew my conscientious objector status. Nonetheless, those folks had an enormous influence on me, so that when I've always been uncomfortable when some of my fellow liberals talked about completely separating religion from politics.
Right.
The late Gene Elstein said separation of church and state is one thing, separation of religion and politics is something else. And for me, they were inseparable in the way that I thought, they were inseparable in the way I thought. And I once debated Ralph Reed, and I said I will always defend Ralph's right to base his political conclusions on his religious conclusions, but I do want to ask him where Jesus endorses a cut in the capital gains tax, because I just couldn't find it in my scripture.
Galatians 23.
I think it's in Philippians. Yeah, sorry.
You could do the parable of the talents. I've thought about that, but we will leave it at that.
And David, you are Jewish and you were raised Jewish. You've lately taken to quoting St. Augustine with great fervor.
It's America's leading Augustine scholar.
I know, and you've spoken and written about learning, really loving reading theology as you were writing The Road to Character. Talk about that.
Yeah, first I didn't know EJ went through a youthful liberal Republican phase. It's pathetic in your 50s, in your 20s. It's just tragic.
That's the second worst thing David ever said about me. The worst thing David ever said about me is that I was the only person he ever met whose eyes light up at the words panel discussion. That's mean.
Well, so I guess the reason I went into, when you write a column, one of the things you learn is to be narcissistic. And you learn to explore your stuff in public. And so I think since we met, I've become much more religiously inclined. And that's, I think, for three things. First, for an awareness of one's moral mediocrity. And so I met, for example, you meet these people who radiate an inner light. And I was in Frederick, Maryland, I don't know how many years ago, and I ran into these ladies, there were probably 30 of them, age 50 to 80, who teach immigrants English and then how to read it. And I walk into the room, and they just radiate patience and goodness, Dorothy Day directness, just that calmness. And they didn't know me from Adam, but they made me feel funnier and smarter and special, and they just had that, they radiated that light. And I remember thinking, I've achieved way more career success than I ever thought I would, but I don't have that. And so that became, and when it's so easy to grade yourself on a forgiving curve, and I was certainly doing that. Second would be the experience of grace. And the story I tell about that, these are just exemplar stories, but I have a million of them. I was driving home from the NewsHour about 10 years ago, and I pull into my driveway, and it's 7:30 at night, but it's summer, so it's still light out. And my kids, who are then 12, 9, and 4, were in the backyard kicking a supermarket ball up in the air, and they were running across the yard, chasing down this ball, tumbling all over each other, laughing, giggling, sort of shouting with joy. And I pull up into the driveway and I see into the backyard. I get confronted with this tableau of perfect family happiness. And the sun's coming through the trees. My lawn, for some reason, looks perfect. And so I just sit there staring at it through the windshield. And it's one of those moments where reality sort of spills outside its boundaries and time and life sort of suspended, and you become aware of a happiness that you don't deserve. Which is grace. And when that happens, your soul swells up a little, and you want to be worthy of that happiness. And it's just a moment when the soul is swelling. And so that was another step. And then, lately one experience is love. And deep love. And the nice thing, Christian Wyman, who's a poet I've quoted in your presence before, says love is always on the move. It's never content to just love one thing. And so you want to love the person, you want to love, but then your flesh sort of gets opened up, exposing soft flesh below, and you realize your riches are not in yourself, and then you desire these fusions. There's a quote I'm about to mangle from Captain Corelli's Mandolin, the Louis de Bernier novel, and it's an old guy talking to his daughter, and he's talking about the love he had for his late wife. And he says, again, I'm going to bangle it a little, love is a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. As the years went by, our roots underground grew together, so when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we discovered we were one tree and not two. And that sort of desire and even awareness of a fusion at that deep level sort of changes your view. And so when you go through these experiences, theology begins to make sense because it speaks spiritually, emotionally, and morally. And so it's not like I read it because I'm suddenly well, it's not an academic enterprise, it's the way to see the world. And so it's become an explanatory tool as much as anything else.
That's so beautiful, and it makes me not want to talk about the election, which is what I had planned next. I think we have to, but let's be quick. It's notable, I think, that religion has played a very small overt role in this election relative to the last 30 or 40 years. And also in this campaign, like the very last, with Obama, and especially the last campaign, reversing this trend of decades, the candidate most articulate about her religious formation is the Democrat, which was also true in the last presidential election, was Obama. EJ, you wrote this book, Sold Out, that is S-O-U-L-E-D, Sold Out, Reclaiming Faith and Politics After the Religious Right. But I don't think the post-religious right era has turned out the way you or many people actually thought it would. I mean, that was true. We were in the post-religious right era, but let's talk about what that actually looks like it means now. You want to start?
Yeah, I think that, your point about Hillary Clinton being far more articulate about her faith and also being a person whose faith has clearly informed
But she still doesn't talk about it very much, right? I mean, it's still very, it's not an issue. It's not much of a subject.
And I think it's an interesting problem for Democrats because Democrats have a far more complicated coalition problem than Republicans do. That the Democrats include the most religious people in the country and the most unreligious people in the country. That is to say, African Americans are, by most of the polling measures, the most religious people in the country. But a very large share of the Democratic constituency is very consciously secular and not engaged in religious institutions.
Right.
Holding that coalition together across these religious divides, it is also, the Democratic Party is also more Muslim, more Hindu. It's a very broad religious coalition. So some Democrats want candidates to speak the way Clinton did, say, at the, I guess it was the National Baptist Convention, where she was very explicit about her faith journey and how directly it related to her own politics. Her experience also involved Martin Luther King. She actually saw him in person, and it moved her, was brought there by her Methodist minister. And then you have Donald Trump, whose religious experience seemed limited, although there is this interesting reporting people have done that Norman Vincent Peale is actually the main influence on Donald Trump religiously. But to go to the religious right, I think you're seeing among religious conservatives a fascinating split in this election. Now, at the moment, at least until Friday at about 4:20, the white evangelical Christians were overwhelmingly for Trump, but there was still a split. And in the primaries, they split pretty closely between Trump on the one side and Cruz and Rubio on the other. And there are a lot of explanations for this, but the way I've looked at it, and by the way, I want to thank Mark Valeri for reminding me of the name of the First Baptist church minister in Dallas. There's sort of a traditional religious conservative view where you look to religion to help you discern your way in politics. Now, for those religious Christians, conservative religious Christians, it leads them to emphasize issues like gay marriage and abortion, and those are largely the ones who voted for mostly Rubio or Cruz, especially in Iowa.
But I mean, I'm not so interested in actually talking about religious conservatives, partly because they're not here with us.
Could I just finish the one? Let me just do the other half real quick.
Yeah.
Because I think Trump has drawn, I think there is a dangerous thing going on to religion, and that is the other side is becoming tribal, where it is not an effort to seek discernment. It is an identification with a group, feeling that that group is under attack, being pushed aside in the society. And so Jeffress gave a series of sermons where we will basically support an imperfect man, we'll put it that way for Trump, because he will be a kind of strong hand to rout this enemy and restore our place in the society. There was always some of that going on with religious conservatism, but I think the tribal side of identification has been stronger here and helps explain how many Christian conservatives who, as the head of the Baptist convention, you know who I mean, Russell Moore has said, thank you, who have no business supporting Trump, how they're getting there.
Right.
And that's really an important, new, and to me, disturbing development.
Well, what I think I'm more interested in probing is, you talked about things like a reformation that you thought would follow. So you may have been right about me, but you said that religious moderates, this new reformation will privilege religious moderation over religious conservatism. You also talked about how many Americans, and not just atheists, at many points in these last 20, 30 years, would have been very happy for religious voices to shut up and clear out of the public square. I guess my point is, I think to a great extent they have. I mean, they are not a force in political life the way they were before, but are we in a better place for that? I mean, so again, what is this post-religious right? What is religion in the public square in this post-religious right era? What are its contours?
Well, we're in a worse place for it. I think a lot of us are nostalgic for an era when you had Reinhold Niebuhr, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Paul Tillich, an era where there were public theologians gathering a mass audience, appearing on the cover of Time magazine. And that wasn't necessarily because they brought their denominational knowledge, but because they spoke fluidly about the spirit, the emotions, and they brought a moral conversation. And I happen to think we're now in a culture that's over-politicized and under-moralized. And so EJ and I go on TV shows and we talk about every slight wiggle in whatever the candidates are doing that happened that week. But there's so little conversation about the virtues of suffering, what sin is, what the word redemption means. And these are words that have fallen out of the common vocabulary and been replaced among my students with simply a utilitarian vocabulary. And so I do think one of the reasons I long for a more active religious voice in the public square, and I have a set of formulas, we need to become more communitarian in a society that's become too individual. We need to become more moralistic in a society that's too utilitarian. And we need to be more emotional in a society that's too cognitive. And religion speaks those three languages very well. And without without them, we're just denuded. And it's not that we're bad; we're just morally inarticulate. I wrote this book, which has a chapter, say, on Dorothy Day, and I would go into these on my book tour. I'd go into these convention halls, and there'd be a bunch of 63-year-old white CFOs from major corporations, and they looked like the most boring human beings on the face of the earth. And they had just spent the last 3 days talking about quarterly reports and healthcare costs and benefit packages. And we walk into this room, as my publisher had sent me there, and I walk in and I see all these sea of inert faces. And I'm going to talk to them about Dorothy Day's pregnancy and her prayer and her suffering, her moments of anguish. And I would walk into the room thinking, this is not going to go well. And almost without exception, when I spoke, say, the language of day, and the language of sin, the language of redemption, the language of deep humility, and the language of her raw emotionality, there was a quality of silence in those audiences that I've rarely experienced in public before, because they are hungry like everybody else. And human nature has not changed. The yearning for righteousness is still there, and it's just not being met by the public sphere, except for by you. And that's just a fundamental problem in our discussion.
I think one of the contrasts that I think about that relates to what David said is when you think about the civil rights Christianity that rose in the 50s and 60s. It was underground before that. But it was a civil rights Christianity very much supported by Niebuhr, by Heschel, even though he was Jewish, but was a great friend of Dr. King's. And there was a spirit in that form of Christianity that was, on the one hand, militant and demanding of justice, but on the other hand, the preaching of Martin Luther King was very much about conversion and redemption. And King, and it went back to one of the stories we heard in the earlier panel, that King actually believed you could convert adversaries. And we have very little of a sense that conversion is possible now in our political conversation, and that and conversion is a two-way street. I love the way Ibu talked about his dad and the bourgeois money to go to the bourgeois college. But in fact, in those conversations, people have to change themselves as they engage with each other.
Right, so that's by conversion you mean, that willingness to be changed by each other.
Yes,
and by that relationship.
I very much identified with what he said about, in this campaign, about the need for empathy. There's the old religious formulation, hate the sin, love the sinner. I think we should fear Trump, but understand that while some of his constituency, and Hillary Clinton got a lot of grief for this, there is racial backlash plays a real role in the Trump vote. That's just true. That's been true in politics for a long time. But the discontents that Ibu described so well are discontents that people who are on the progressive side ought to be dealing with. The guy in the factory who discovers the factory isn't there anymore and his income is cut in half. And I think after this election is over, which is, I agree with you, where we can usefully take this, I do think we need a conversation across these lines. I'd love to see Hillary Clinton, if she won, spending the first few weeks going to the parts of the country she lost, going to Appalachia, going to the smaller mill towns, and saying, there is a problem here. You have a legitimate grievance. We need, as a society, to lift everybody up, and we're not doing that. That's the kind of conversion approach that King had. But I think this religious mainstream that David just talked about is much weaker in our public conversation altogether.
If I could be hopeful, the old 50s mainline Protestant is not coming back. Sorry for this architecture. But I've sort of been quietly delighted by the events of the campaign as it affects, frankly, the future of the Christian's presence in American public. Because the people who endorsed Donald Trump on the Republican side and on the evangelical side did so obviously because he embodies the Christian virtues of humility, grace, charity. They did so because evangelical had become a noun, an identity group. And he thought he was the power player for their identity group. And they did it with open eyes. But the people who did so tended to be older and part of the fading evangelical establishment. And if you look at people under 40 or young rising leaders like Russell Moore, they were all appalled from the beginning. And the polls now suggest millennials are becoming disaffected from religion, and I get that. But as I go around, especially to cities, I see just an exploding religion that, believe me, is deeply religious, but the opposite of Trumpism. Say, pick New York City. There's a burgeoning supply of these churches, these plants, Trinity Grace churches, that are all around the city. There's Q3 churches, which I went to one in Williamsburg in Brooklyn a few months ago, and every beautiful hipster in New York seemed to be at that church. And if you were wanted to be where the cool crowd was, that church was it. And the Redeemer plants that
and I think probably most of them are still checking the none box on the pew poll.
Right.
As unaffiliated, but this is their experience.
Those, by the way, were the folks I was describing in the book. That part of the prediction in the book, just as my prediction about you was right.
A lot of it was right. A lot of it was right.
Boy, don't correct EJ.
No, but that was part of the point, because the book did draw this very sharp line that David is drawing between the over a certain age and younger evangelicals and others who are coming to religion, including some of the nuns who are, some have rejected religion altogether, some have simply rejected organized religion as they came to understand it, but are still fascinated by religious questions.
Why would we be surprised that people who came of age in those years of toxic religiosity would grow up allergic to religious stridency and wary of declaring themselves, declaring that as their identity?
But I even think some of these people, I go to these churches and they're all like 3. They're like right out of the womb. And so they grew up in an age of secularism. They've got nothing to rebel against.
Right, they have no baggage.
They've got no baggage, no bad associations. And what's interesting to me is they go for a faith which was super charismatic, Hillsong, arms in the air. I've never done that in my life. But religiously reasonably rigorous in theology and in the study of Scripture, and also incredibly affirming. I mean, I have to have a riff that because of a lot of ways my generation has parented badly, people are more emotional and fragile than they used to be. So there's a lot of the faith which you see on college campuses in secular and religious context. You're so wonderful. You were great. Way to go. And so there's just oceans of affirmation in these. So it's not Jonathan Edwards. It's, I don't know, somebody else.
Okay, let's talk about sin. This is a word you have both used. I find it remarkable, right? So, I mean, let's go there. David, you've been talking about, as you quote St. Augustine around the country, St. Augustine's notion of disordered love. That's a definition of sin. And also, but how that is also a way to diagnose us, right? And the political state of our soul.
Yeah, somebody, it might have been C.S. Lewis, said original sin, or maybe Chesterton, original sin is the only concept with scientifically verifiable proof. That we are, sin.
See, I attribute it to Niebuhr, and he got it from somebody else.
Didn't Niebuhr say you just have to read today's newspaper to know there's something to it?
Yeah, or look in the mirror.
Original sin is the only empirically verifiable doctrine of the Christian church.
Right.
It's one of my favorite lines.
And so the question is, and for me the challenge was how to express it in a secular audience. I'm a secular writer. I don't write for religious audiences. I write for the New York Times. How secular can you get? And my joke, I can't help inserting my joke. My joke of being a conservative columnist of the New York Times is like being chief rabbi at Mecca. It's not a lot of not totally fair, but it's a joke. And so I wrote this book, and Augustine was central to it, and I think the awareness of sin is central to Niebuhr, who was that we are sinful, that we're more sinful than we think, even when we think we're taking the purest action, and we have to be aware of that sinfulness. But how do you talk about sin in modern America? And I had gone on the Charlie Rose show, my closest encounter to heaven until recently, and I had talked about my book before it came out, and I talked about the word sin, and I got an email from an editor in New York at a different publishing house. And he said, I love the way you were talking about your book, but I didn't like the way you used that word sin. It's a downer. Use the word insensitive instead. And so I forwarded his email to my editor at Random House. It was sort of a test of him. And he said, well, that's why you're writing the book, to redeem sin. But then how do you talk about it? You really can't talk about original sin. People just push you away. And so I go to Augustine's concept of disordered loves, which is we all love a lot of things, and we all know some loves are higher than others. Our love of truth should be higher than our love of money. But because of some screw up in our nature, we get our loves out of order all the time. So if a friend blabs to you a secret and you tell it at a dinner party, you're putting your love of popularity above your love of friendship. And that's a sin. And I think in this world, which doesn't like to peer darkly into brokenness, it's easier to swallow the concept of two positive things that are out of order. And that's the way you can introduce the concept of sin. But a lot of what we have to do is reintroduce these concepts in a way that people won't immediately think you're preaching at.
Right. And it's a downer. And EJ, you wrote this, I believe a serious embrace of Christianity inevitably leads one into politics, since sin is social as well as individual.
Right, and it can be about the same sort of hierarchy of disorders in a society. that David is talking about. I do think that the rejection of sin is more popular on college campuses than it is in the country as a whole. I think the country still has a sense of sin. I agree there's more feel-good religion, more therapeutic religion going on than there used to be, and there's clearly a more secular mass opinion than there used to be. And yet I think there is a profound sense of right and wrong in the country. So I think sin is stronger than you're giving it credit for in the country. But I think there has always been, it's been one of the classic arguments between more progressive and more conservative Christians about where is the emphasis on social sin versus individual sin.
Right.
And one area, for example, where that often comes out is in our discussion of family life and the rise of the single-parent family and what does that mean to the society. And if there's one issue I wish after this election were over, maybe you can do it on your show single-handedly, where we need a very different conversation, it's on the family. Because if, on the one hand, if you care about family values, you've got to care about social justice, because one of the reasons the family is under such pressure is the way in which the economy is a battering ram at times against the family, particularly among folks who have lost jobs that once supported families. And so you cannot look at family breakup without looking at the economic factors. On the other hand, and this is really the theme of Bob Putnam's Our Kids, we also know that as a practical matter, most of the time two parents are better than one, and that the kids who grow up in sort of more stable, intact families are likely to do better. Conservatives want to talk about one half of that truth. Progressives want to focus on the other half of that truth. And yet they are really part of one truth that we need to discuss. And I actually think, oddly...
To discuss more holistically.
More holistically,
yeah.
and where each side needs to accept an insight. Oddly, I think the acceptance of gay marriage could help this conversation.
It gives us a template?
Because it gives us, David wrote a wonderful column a long time ago, basically saying that he was for gay marriage as a conservative demand, because he believed in fidelity and commitment, and if you believed in fidelity and commitment, you ought to want it available to all of our brothers and sisters. And I think that, it took in a way, it took the gay and lesbian community to put marriage back on the agenda in a way that I think could help us have a better conversation in this sphere. But I do think that we need to acknowledge, the role of individual and social responsibility, and that the two have almost always gone together, and we often in politics drive them apart.
Right. And EJ, one of the things you pointed out is that you write a lot about the joy of the progressive worldview, but a weakness is, as Niebuhr understood, a lack of awareness of human frailty. So I wonder if, and I want to come to something, David, you've been writing about the lack of aspirational thinking in political culture right now, and I actually wonder if there's some connection between an inability to talk about sin, or whatever word you want to use to talk about what we're speaking of there, this human reality. Here's David, I just want to read, this is a column you wrote on September 30th. There is no uplift in this race. There is an entire absence in both campaigns of any effort to appeal to the higher angels of our nature. There is an assumption in both campaigns that we are self-seeking creatures rather than also loving, serving, hoping, dreaming, cooperating creatures. There is a presumption in both candidates that the lowest motivations are the most real. At some point, there will have to be a new vocabulary and a restored anthropology emphasizing love, friendship, faithfulness, solidarity, and neighborliness that pushes people toward connection rather than distrust. And then you said millennials want to be active in this rebinding, but inspiration certainly isn't coming from the aging boomers now on stage.
Always bash
That's
the
an
boomer.
excellent description of the Trump campaign. I actually want to have that conversation.
A partisan note rears its ugly head.
No,
But
just
do you- but no,
I want. Let me just say before David,
yeah.
because I really do think that's a false equivalence. I don't deny that a lot of the Hillary Clinton campaign has been directed at Donald Trump, and it's scaring the country to death about a Trump presidency, which seems to me a reasonable argument. But I think if you first of all look at whose candidate has the slogan "Strongest Together," which candidate has the slogan "Stronger Together," which candidate has occasionally given speeches on issues like national service. You know, Clinton gave an excellent speech on national service, which got completely buried under Donald Trump's 3 a.m. tweets. No one paid attention to that speech. What I'm saying is that while you are right about the overall tenor of this campaign, I really do think that it does, that the critique weighs far more heavily on the Trump side of the campaign, and that you can argue that Clinton has failed to make this positive side of her campaign penetrate more. But I would assert that that has a lot more to do with the nature of the choice, and that some of that is still there.
But I wonder if what this is about, actually, to try to pull away from, the election is again the narrative we privilege, right? There's a lot of aspirational thinking and aspirational action out there, but I think it is true that on the whole, our political story is very dark, and it's not calling citizens to rise to their best selves, or at least what we're emphasizing in the way, we journalists, what we're emphasizing in the way we report. I don't know.
Oh, I will always agree with EJ that the Trump campaign is even worse than the Clinton campaign. That's a general rule. And I've given up trying to convert him on some things. But I do think I've
never given up converting David on. I want him to come all the way over someday. I believe in conversion.
But a lot of our failures are failures because we have an inadequate ideal. And that's true in college life, that's true in adult life. We just don't have in our head what's possible. And we all, I don't know if I've read this phrase recently, we all walk in shoes too small for us. And I do think what's been lost in this country is the American ideal, and the possibility of the American story, as we were hearing earlier, and the possibility of politics. And, Europeans came to these shores, and they saw forests that stretched on to infinity. They saw flocks of geese so big it took them 45 minutes to take off. They were overawed by the abundance. And they had two thoughts: that God's plan for humanity could be completed here on this continent, and two, they could get really rich in the process. And ever since, there's been this moral materialism has been driving Americans. And they noticed this in the 1830s, Tocqueville, that people would come, say, through Ohio to perfectly good farmland, and they'd keep going because they presumed there was something better over the other ridge. And so there has been this future orientation. And King had both an awareness of the deep sinfulness and a deep hopefulness about the arc of justice. And what's been lost, I think, is teaching that American story in the mainstream. Even the consensus historians of the 50s, the basic premise of the American ideal. And so by all sorts of measures, the younger you get, the less patriotic you are. And so that story is lost. And then I think celebrating the rituals that bind us together. And here I'll get a little controversial. I do think there are so few things that bind us together, but the American creed is one of them, and the rituals of Americanness are one of them. And I grew up really in an immigrant household, and our dream was making it in America, which meant getting out of Brooklyn and Queens, the Bronx. And that dream was the powering dream, as it has been for a lot of people. And when you begin to kneel during the national anthem, you're weakening, I think, or insulting not the current reality, which we all want to insult, but the possibility that we'll end up in the same place. And I think you're also insulting the inherent radicalism of the country. That the Declaration, even the national anthem, certainly the Constitution, are not status quo reactionary documents from an old establishment. They're radical. And radicals have always used them as the strongest hammer for change. And that possibility has been lost, and then the possibility of glory and greatness through politics has been lost. And all my students want to be Bono. They all want to go off and do an NGO, but not caring about politics is first the luxury of those who live in a healthy society, because those who live in a corrupt society and a violent society don't have the luxury of not caring about politics. And second, it's to limit your dreams. The people I know who've served in government, for them, that's the most intense moment of their life, because the decisions were the most consequential. I have a close friend who's in the Obama administration now, and she says, every day sucks. The overall experience is tremendously rewarding. And I think somehow we have to revive the idealism of political service.
Mm-hmm.
Could I just say something on what David said? Two things. One, on the nature of how political changes happen here, and the other on the nobility of politics that we've lost. On political change, I have a more, if you will, dialectical view of it. On the one hand, I agree with you, because I think it's historically accurate, that prophets, Lincoln and King are the two best examples, have used the American tradition, the American documents, the Constitution, the Declaration, to achieve radical reform. That is true. But King and Lincoln also had people, if you will, to their left. Lincoln had the abolitionists. William Lloyd Garrison burned the American Constitution. There were people on the outside pushing. King had, as the Civil Rights movement went on, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, pushing.
Right.
So I think there is, when reform movements succeed, a dialectic between the people who burn the Constitution and the people who revere it, between the people who kneel at the national anthem and those who say, no, we have to embrace our symbols, our country. And so, yes, I put my hand over my heart when at baseball games and everywhere else when we do the national anthem. I love these symbols and I love the civic liturgy, but I get why people have felt at moments in our history the need to push, sometimes by rejecting those symbols. But where I very much, I think, David and I identify with each other is, I was thinking about these two panels today. The first was called Religion and the Common Good, and the second was called Religion and Politics. And unfortunately this year, it is quite appropriate to separate those two. Wouldn't it be nice 4 years from now, when Marie brings us all back together, where we could actually bring them together because we thought about politics as intimately connected to the common good. And we have been bad-mouthing politics. I mean, Americans have always bad-mouthed politics to some degree, and that's the healthy birthright of a country that mistrusts power. But we have so lost the dignity of what politics is about, which is, politics in a democratic republic is about solving problems and resolving disputes peacefully, usually through argument and negotiation. We don't even know how to argue anymore. Christopher Lasch, the great historian, wrote a wonderful essay called The Lost Art of Argument, in which he said, in true argument, people enter imaginatively into each other's ideas, if only initially to change the other person's mind, but in the process they put their own ideas at risk. Bill Buckley, when he had his firing line show, engaged in real argument. He brought on really smart liberals whom he really engaged with. We don't have that kind of argument right now. So I think we have to ennoble the word argument, and we also have to ennoble the word politics.
There was, I opened up my Twitter feed, and I really do not read it, every tweet that comes through, but I happened to see yours, I don't know, a couple weeks ago, and it said, reading Habakkuk in church, they're quoting from the Bible, there is strife and clamorous discord, the rash one has no integrity. Clamorous discord as a
I left
something
out,
in
by the way.
contrast to argument.
Right.
EJ, you're live tweeting the Eucharist.
It's like
In fact, a friend of mine tweeted back, "You're tweeting in church," and I said, "No, I did that from the parking lot."
Okay.
I waited till after Mass before
right.
I sent that tweet.
But all right, so we're running out of time, and I'm in radio, so I believe in the clock. So let's see if I can be clear. So so I think to your point, EJ, a minute ago, it's not that everything is equal, but there's something about the way we're all now in react mode, and there's also something completely disordered about the way I think you would both agree that journalism has emerged, and the way we cover things that skews, that is not good for us. It's not good for common life. We're not going to solve that this week. But the truth is that behind what comes out as clamorous discord and rashness and anger and sometimes what looks like danger, there's a lot of what's actually happening among people in the country. And you said you would like to see Hillary Clinton out listening to those people, but I think it's not just about listening for policy options, right? I mean, I think something that Donald Trump has done is that he has let pain be in the room. Let's talk about thinking as we move out of this discussion into this world we're going to inhabit. What that work is. And David, I mean, you wrote, as many journalists did, including just about every columnist in the New York Times, about waking up to this pain that you hadn't taken as seriously as you realized you should have.
So I wrote 6 million columns explaining why Donald Trump would not get the Republican nomination, and decided that he'll be taking the oath of office, riding down Pennsylvania Avenue, and I'll be writing, "Don't worry, this will not happen." And so then I've spent the last 7 months trying to figure out how I got that so wrong. And I will say that it's not been a depressing trip. There's a lot of pain I can talk about, but I'm going to end on an up note. Because everywhere I went, there were healers. In Houston, there's a little triangle where Latinos live within these 3 highways. And a woman from the Northeast, young woman, realized there were no after-school programs, so she moved in there, and she created an after-school program with hundreds of kids. And I found those people everywhere. In New Mexico, at a Navajo reservation, 2 couple that moved down from Minneapolis started a drug treatment program for 60-year-old ex-cons. Not glamorous work. They had $17 in the bank account the day we visited. I go in D.C., I have 2 friends named Kathy and David, and they had a kid who went to a public school, and that kid had a friend who had no real home. His dad had split, mom had drug and health problems, so they said to the kid, "Come over, stay with us. You can live with us, eat if you need, go to school." And then that kid had a friend in the same circumstance, and that kid had a friend. And so if you go to their house, and I do every Thursday and hopefully on Mondays, there's 10, 15, 25 kids there, 18 to 22, just getting some food. Last week, a young woman came and said she was 21. This was the first time she'd been around a dinner table since she was 11. And it took my daughter once, and she said, "This is the warmest home I've ever been in." They call Kathy and David Mom and Dad, and there's just a warmth and embrace. And when we give them, that we as adults give them the gift of being their audience. And so there's a kid named Ed who would read from his flip phone poetry he'd written. There's a woman named Kasari who would sing like a New Orleans jazz singer. And you just received them, and they defined themselves in front of you. And what they gave to us was a complete intolerance for social distance. So when I meet most of you, I shake hands, and there's a little distance there because we don't really know each other. But the first time I walked into their house, I reached my hand out to one of the kids, and he said, "We don't shake hands here. We hug." And so big hugs, and you're just physically draped around each other. And we were in a forum, and I quoted this guy, Bill Milliken, who happened to be in the audience last time Krista and I were together. And he's been working on youth issues for 50 years. And he said, I'm often asked, in 50 years of doing this, what programs work to turn around lives? And he said, I've done this 50 years, I've never seen a program turn around a life. I see relationships turn around lives, and I see love turn around lives. And so setting up those contexts is what's being done at a local level. And the problem for journalists, and this is why religion has become a way of seeing the world for me, a lot of things are more clear and more explicable if you begin with the presence that each of us has a God-given human soul, all of which are equal. And suddenly you begin to see the soul in each person and how that soul was created, how it was formed, and what it longs for. And when you see that, you see on a much more personalist level, Emerson said, souls are not saved in bundles. And some of the big arcs and spheres of politics seem a little less relevant, and the individual relationships seem a lot more important, and you begin to adopt a more personalist and I think a more realistic lens. So Donald Trump has given me a reason to live this year, to oppose him, but I confess I've lost a lot of interest in politics because it doesn't seem to me the primary reality anymore.
I just want to say on that last note that I have never, I can't think of anyone who loves politics more than I do, and I have never seen a campaign that I wanted to end so much, so quickly as this one. I have never felt that way in my entire life, and I've thought about why. I want to underscore something David said, which is the notion that each person is endowed with dignity by God is one of the most powerful and radical ideas that we have available to us. If I made a hat that looked like the Donald Trump hat, it would be Make America Empathetic Again. And I think that, again, what I referred to earlier, I would like the empathy to run both ways. It is fair to criticize parts of the Trump movement for racism, for a feeling about immigrants that is absolutely unacceptable, attitudes toward immigrants that is absolutely unacceptable. There are traces of anti-Semitism in some of that movement. We should call all those out. And we would ask people on that side to have empathy for the young kid who is shot on the street, who is unarmed, who is African American, to have empathy for for a child who has come here as an immigrant kid who wants to advance in our society. But what we owe in return is the empathy for people on the other side. There shouldn't be groups that it is fashionable to be empathetic toward and unfashionable to be empathetic toward. And one of the things that strikes me the most, and one of the great losses of politics in this campaign, is if you look at the forces that have hurt people in the inner city, the deindustrialization, the loss of jobs that were providing mobility routes for African Americans, they are exactly the same problems that of deindustrialization that have affected white working class people. And we desperately need a conversation that brings two groups that are at odds together. So I want to close in two ways. One is just with two of my favorite thoughts about politics. One is a line from Mike Sandel that I sort of think of all the time, the philosopher Mike Sandel, who said, when politics goes well, we can know a good in common that we cannot know alone. That is the proper view of politics. And another wonderful writer called Glenn Tinder talked about our need to create the attentive society, which is a society in which all of us acknowledge the need both to give and to receive help on the road to truth. And I want to close where you started, which is on grace. Wayne Fields, who was a person who helped found this great center, and I were talking today, and we discovered we had a remarkably similar grace experience. Wayne had a granddaughter who was very sick. And what he discovered is that his greatest partners in this were all the folks on the kitchen staff here at Wash U. And some member of the kitchen staff started praying for this girl. And then their whole church was praying for this girl. And they went to other people on the kitchen staff. And by the time it was over, he figured that half the churches in St. Louis were praying for this girl. And these were people he could turn to. And I told him about my experience of grace, which is of this sort, which is, there was a homeless man I used to pass every day going to the Washington Post, and we used to talk. I would give him some money, and we'd have good chats, and I'd go on to the Post. And then my son was very sick when he was 3 years old, and fortunately he's all better now, and he's 23 years old. And but I talked to him about this, and my homeless friend said, I will pray for him. And James actually got better, and I've told James that I actually attribute some of this to my homeless friend. The amazing thing is he and I didn't see each other for a while. He moved somewhere else, and then we ran into each other. It was 6 or 8 or 10 years later, and the first words out of his mouth were, "How is your son?" That is grace. And Wayne said that we don't pay attention to this because they're momentary events, but it's the momentary that links you to the eternal. And I owe that to Wayne.
Mm-hmm. So I did tell David that I wanted him to read a poem at the end, but he said he's proposed a song. And
Beyonce's Formation.
And EJ said that all of his columns are poetry, and I'm going to have to invoke my moderator's discretion and say we don't have time, sadly, for either of your presentations. I do, however. So EJ, I want to come back to end this with a question that you raised in Sold Out, or a challenge that in the post-religious right era, we need to develop a more capacious imagination about the proper role of religion in political life, and I would just add public life. And I actually want to read some words of Senator John Danforth, possibly an answer he might give if he were up here with us. If there is a Christian agenda for politics, what should it be? I, for one, cannot be certain. Then one might ask, what does faith bring to politics if not an agenda? For me, it brings a struggle to do God's will that always falls short of the goal. It leavens the competing self-interest of politics with the yeast of the love commandment, but it seldom fulfills the love commandment. It makes us better participants in politics, but not the custodians of God's politics. So just to close, I'd like to ask you both, and maybe EJ, you first, since you posed that question. What is your imagination? You spoke a couple of years ago about a new reformation of religion and politics that would come after the religious right. So give us some of the contours of that more capacious imagination for you about how this might come to work.
The wisest thing to do would be just to say amen to what you just read and leave it at that. But I am, alas, not wise, so I'll try to answer the question. There are a few things I'd like to see happen, some of which are happening, and David alluded to some of them. All the great religious traditions emphasize our obligations to the least among us, to the marginal, to the left out. Are there ways of talking across stark political lines about what we can do together about this? People here might be amused to know that 20 years ago, I think, David and I were asked to write about compassionate conservatism for the Washington Post. I defended compassionate conservatism, and David criticized it, which just shows...
Which has?
What? And I think there was a loss that the compassionate conservatives fail for a variety of reasons, but there were some insights there that ought to be able to open a new conversation again. And if Hillary Clinton wins, actually, it's intriguing because she is actually very interested in the role of religious institutions in building civil society and solving problems. So I'd like a conversation about poverty. I've alluded to a conversation about family life. And it's not a judgmental conversation, it's just a realistic conversation about what we owe children in our society at this moment. We need what Ibu has been talking about a lot, which is an understanding that the America that was, as Will Herberg said in the 50s, Protestant Catholic Jew, is now Protestant Catholic Jew, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, Buddhist, and a whole lot of other
secular
things.
humanists.
And secular humanists,
Yeah.
and atheists. And we need a different kind of religious conversation. I thought one of the best speeches President Obama ever gave was his speech to the Call to Renewal Conference before he was president, where he talked about the respect that religious conservatives owed to secular people and vice versa. So I think we need a new conversation, and that's fair. And lastly, I wish that religion could play a role in bringing us together. There used to be a time when people who disagreed went to the same churches or congregations. They had an instinctive trust in each other. They could argue from respect, and they didn't assume bad faith. Is there any way in which religious institutions could try to play that role again? I came from a very argumentative extended family, and we always argued about politics, and we never doubted that we loved each other. You cannot do that very much in our politics now outside the family, and I think our religious institutions might struggle to be venues for that. And I'm not talking about bringing people together artificially. The hardest thing to reach is authentic disagreement, but not disagreement among people who then leave and hate each other forever, but disagreement among people who respect each other and know they have to live with each other the next morning.
So I was once writing in a newspaper column, I was griping about how hard it was to get people to be good by my lectures to them in my classroom. And I got an email from a guy named Dave Jolly, who's a veterinarian in Oregon, and he said, what a wise person says is the least of that which he gives. What gets communicated is the small gestures and the whole totality of their being. That is to say, the small gestures of kindness, of graciousness, of honesty, of hard truth-telling. And then he says, never forget the message is the person. And those words rang in, because we deal in words all the time, but those sentences, what a wise person says is the least of that which he gives, and the message is the person, struck me as profoundly true. And so EJ knows intra-Catholic Church politics better than I do, but with Pope Francis, to me, the message is the person. We know a guy, I think you know Monsignor Ray East in D.C., just a joyous person who looks for the good news in people and just treats each day and each problem with a sense of graciousness and joy. I know a rabbi named Meir Soloveichik on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, the same spirit. And it seems to me what religion guides us towards is not certainly policies, but certain ways of being. Just by valuing them, and you don't need religion to be a good person. Believe me, I know a lot of religious people are complete schmucks. But I do think it pushes emphasis on humility, radical self-awareness from a position of other-centeredness, awareness of the deep equality of all human beings, because each of us are broken in similar ways. Grace, the receiving and giving of unmerited love. These are just things that are talked about. So from a politics of the future, what I would hope for is not necessarily certain policies or theological discussions, but just ways of being. The people we remember then stick in our heads. And I go to the modern Orthodox churches, synagogues, we call them.
Telltale sign from David.
And I just see young people who are theologically super rigorous and warm to each other. And then I go to the churches I mentioned in Brooklyn and Williamsburg, or super hipster churches, and there's just a native warmth. And you just are drawn to that by, flowers to the sun. And so all I want out of religion is just a little more human decency, inspired by a devotion to God. And I do think that's eminently possible and eminently happening.
Well, I do think, we don't have Niebers anymore and we don't have Heschels, but I think that the mantle of public theology actually can fall on journalists, and we've seen that demonstrated, and it's very interesting. So thank you, David Brooks. Thank you, E.J. Dionne. Thank you so much to the Danforth Center for bringing us all together.
Thank you.